The frontier provides the first example of the conflict between idealism and realism. On the frontier, there was a limited government presence. It was the place where the federal government was the weakest. It was the place where the government overall was the weakest. There are very few people living on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. If you remember, the Greenville government in London had placed a line down the Appalachian Mountains telling the British colonists not to cross it. That on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains were Native American reserves. The British government had promised this land to Native Americans in exchange for peace. When the early Republic took control of these lands after the Revolutionary War, the revolutionary government wanted to open those lands to American settlers. This produced a conflict between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in this region. After the Revolutionary War, tensions flared in the Ohio River Valley. The area between the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes was called the Northwest Territory. This territory was supposed to be reserved for Native Americans. This was a region that Native Americans and the French had shared during the early part of the colonial era. When the British took control, they continued those relationships with Native American tribes. At the end of the Revolutionary War, British troops were supposed to withdraw. We've already seen that they didn't. And they continued to use Native Americans to agitate against the new republic. Euro-American settlers, however, found this region inviting and wanted to homestead or set up their own place of residence in this region. To do so, then, they had to overcome Native American opposition. Native Americans were not simply going to give up their land to the new republic. In the Ohio River Valley, Native American tribes joined together in the Miami Confederacy. This Miami Confederacy was meant to resist the American Republic's expansion into the Northwest Territory. They came head-to-head with Euro-American settlers. When Euro-American settlers got in trouble, or they started trouble with Native American tribes, they then called back to the East Coast for support against Native Americans. The United States government sent General Anthony Wayne into the region to bring order, to bring peace. This meant war against Native Americans. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he had success, 1794. This then produced the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The 12 tribes that made up the Miami Confederacy signed an agreement and ceded Ohio and Indiana to the new republic. The word cede means to give up. They had controlled this region for generations. They had expected to maintain control because they had an agreement with the British. They had an agreement with the French. That agreement was broken by the American Republic. Euro-American settlers expected that they could move into this region regardless of the presence of Native Americans. And so they required the 12 tribes to give up this territory. In other words, the 12 tribes lost their freedom. So while Thomas Jefferson wrote the beautiful words that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that meant Euro-Americans. Native American tribes had to give up their lives. Native American tribes had to give up their liberty. Native Americans had to give up their pursuit of happiness in order for Euro-American settlers to move in and take control of the Northwest Territory. In exchange, the Treaty of Greenville offered an annuity to the tribes. An annuity is an annual payment. The tribes could no longer survive on their own. They couldn't hunt, they couldn't fish, they couldn't do the things that their ancestors had done. In exchange for giving up their rights to the land, Native Americans then received payment from the United States government. Native Americans were supposed to then settle down, buy land, shop in Euro-American stores, buy Euro-American goods. In other words, enter into a market economy. They had to give up their way of life and assimilate into Euro-American culture. Assimilation means giving up your culture in order to adopt the culture of another. Native Americans had to assimilate. They had to become white. If not, they faced annihilation. This is an incredible choice to have to make. Either give up your way of life, ways of your ancestors, or die. It is even more ironic that this choice was forced upon them by a group of men who wrote the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Native Americans could keep their lives if they surrendered to the United States of America. Native Americans could gain limited liberty if they surrendered to the United States of America. The United States of America demanded that Native Americans submit to the rule of a foreign government. The United States was a foreign government. In other words, when faced with the choice between limiting the power of the federal government, allowing Native Americans the freedom to live as they wanted to live, and exercising the power of the federal government to subdue Native American tribes, the early republic chose to exercise power, to exert its power over the choices Native Americans made. One of the allures of the frontier was the allure of freedom, getting away from civilization, getting away from government. And so not only did Native Americans believe they could live freely and safely on the frontier, but Euro-Americans saw the frontier as a place that they could get away from civilization. This erupted in the Whiskey Rebellion, 1791-1794. This happened in western Pennsylvania. The event that triggered this rebellion was an excise tax on whiskey. Corn was a very profitable crop in the early republic. But when we think of cornmeal, cornbread, corn on the cob, cream corn. All of those are fine products. But the most profitable use of corn in the early republic was to turn it into whiskey. Whiskey was concentrated. Whiskey could easily be transported. It didn't perish. It could be sold around the world in those wooden barrels. Whiskey is also incredibly addictive. And so frontier farmers sold their corn, turned it into whiskey, and that whiskey then was sold around the world as an alcohol. Just like the English Parliament, the early republic needed to raise taxes to pay for the expense of the frontier. It cost money to keep the frontier safe. It cost money to maintain freedom of the seas. And so the United States government put a tax on whiskey. Now it divided this tax between large flat fees, a one-time fee, an annual fee that large producers could pay. This produced about 6 cents a gallon. On the other hand, small producers could pay by the gallon. They couldn't put all the money up front. This was a greater cost. It cost 9 cents a gallon in this smaller by the gallon. So large producers who could produce tons or barrels and barrels of whiskey only had to pay 6 cents a gallon, but the small businessman, the small farmer, had to pay 9 cents a gallon. This infuriated the farmers of western Pennsylvania. They thought they were getting ripped off by the federal government. And so they refused to pay this whiskey tax. They simply were not going to obey the law. Now, here we have once again a question of taxation, a question of representation. Should the federal government then withdraw, limit its power, or did the federal government exercise its power? Well, in this case, George Washington himself raised 13,000 men in a federal militia. Those men then marched out to western Pennsylvania and told the rebels, lay down your arms, pay your tax, submit to federal authority. Not surprisingly, those farmers, those ragtag bunch on the frontier in western Pennsylvania, seeing George Washington arrive at the head of 13,000 men, decided to submit to federal authority. So George Washington, who led the rebel forces, and part of the mythology around those rebels as they were fighting for lower taxes, here was George Washington leading 13,000 men marching out into western Pennsylvania, telling the farmers of western Pennsylvania, pay your taxes or face the federal army. This is a great example of a question between a real situation and an ideal situation. Ideally, the frontier would bring freedom. Ideally, the frontier would bring low taxes. But instead, George Washington and the federal government needed that frontier to pay for itself. The United States government raised taxes. The frontier farmers said no to those taxes, and so George Washington went out at the head of an army and said, pay your taxes. The real overcame the ideal. Thomas Jefferson provides another example, because Thomas Jefferson was one of the most vocal critics of a large federal government, that the president was exercising undue power under the Constitution. But when given his chance, he did something incredible. Napoleon needed money in his fight in Europe, and so Napoleon offered the United States to purchase Louisiana, the western side of the Mississippi River Valley. Jefferson jumped at the chance. He, on his own authority, offered to buy Louisiana from France. He made the decision, then went to Congress and asked for permission to pay for it. This is the exact opposite of how the Constitution was designed to work. Ideally, a money bill starts in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives debates it. It's the people's house. They then present it to the Senate. The Senate then debates it. They reach a compromise and present it to the president. Here, the president was met with a situation, an offer to expand or to double the size of the United States of America. Instead of waiting for Congress to act, the president signed the purchase agreement, went to Congress, and asked for permission. Now, Congress authorized the purchase, but this was not the ideal. This was a real situation, and where the president acted first, asked for permission second, and Congress ratified his decision and bought Louisiana. Thomas Jefferson was a small government Republican. He was a leader of a group that were called the Democratic Party. They wanted power resting in the hands of the people. They feared a central government. But in this case, when given the opportunity, Thomas Jefferson should have, ideally, under his own ideology, waited and asked for permission first. But he saw an opportunity, and he seized that opportunity, and when he did, he expanded executive authority. He expanded presidential authority. So in these three examples, the frontier provided an opportunity to limit federal authority. The United States could have limited federal authority over Native American tribes. The United States could have limited federal authority over taxing frontier settlements. The United States could have limited federal authority when it came to things like expanding out west. But in each case, the United States expanded the power of the federal government in the early republic. It expanded the power of the federal government to meet the challenges of the frontier and to provide frontier security.